I'm Walter Isaacson of the Aspen Institute. I'm here with best-selling author Cokie Roberts, and we've been talking about the role of women in early America. One of the men who had very complicated relations with women was Thomas Jefferson. Explain, he was not married, right, when he came into office?
Well, he was married earlier, and his wife was the First Lady of Virginia when he was governor of Virginia. But she died as a result of childbirth, and he then went to France as the ambassador and insisted that one of his daughters who hadn't come with him come over, and she came over with a slave woman named Sally Hemmings, and they stayed in France all together. And Jefferson then came back to be Secretary of State, and he did not have a wife, and he wrote constantly that women should just not be involved in politics. Now, he wrote to women about politics, and he wrote to his daughter Martha about politics all the time. But he kept insisting that women not be involved in politics. And he, when he became president, was just totally baffled about how to handle this question of women. And the women of Washington, tiny little town that it was, expected to be entertained at the White House. And at one point, they all went and had a sit-in in the White House and said, you know, you have to be entertaining us. And he came in and just sort of charmed them and sent them away. But when he did have to have big events, he would call on cabinet wives, particularly Dolly Madison, the wife of the Secretary of State, and her sisters to help him entertain at the White House.
But the complicated relationship was with Sally Hemings.
With Sally Hemings, who was a slave. When they were in Paris, she wanted to stay behind. And he promised her that if she came back to America with him, that he would free her children. And I think he was probably in love with her.
And he has children by her.
And he had, as far as we know, he had children by her, children who looked a great deal like him.
Explain how in history we have to figure that out.
Well, in history there were people who always claimed that they were Jefferson's children, but Jefferson's legal children insisted that that was not the case. And so it was an argument for many,
but
many
eventually
years.
the DNA evidence helps.
In the last 10 to 15 years, the DNA has been tested on some Jefferson men, and it has been determined that certainly A. Jefferson was the father of the Hemmings children. And there are records showing that Thomas Jefferson was always there at Monticello about 9 months before these babies were born. But there's 19th century conversation about it all the time. And in fact, Jefferson's grandson writes that there was one of the Hemmings children who was waiting on the table who looked so much like Jefferson that people would do a double take and then just sort of proceed on.
It's particularly complex because we're dealing with the role of a slave and the role of a woman.
It's very complex, and we have, of course, no idea what she thought. And maybe she did love him, who knows? But certainly it was not anything like an equal relationship in terms of power. And Jefferson did not have equal relationships with women. Jefferson's closest confidants were his daughters, and a father-daughter relationship, as loving as it can be, is not an equal relationship.
You know, we revere sometimes Thomas Jefferson as a person who wrote, you know, all men are created equal. And yet that phrase doesn't really mean all people are created equal in his mind. He kept slaves, he treated women differently. What are we to make of that? I mean, does that diminish Jefferson? In my mind, it does in history.
Well, everybody's complicated, Walter, as you know. And so what I feel about these men, and it's one of the reasons I write about the women, is that these men are not bronze and marble deities. These are men, and the women make that clearer than anything else. The women's relationships with them make their humanity so much more real. And I think that makes them more extraordinary. It's easy for a bronze deity to do something remarkable. It's much harder for a flesh and blood human being to do it. And they did it. And so they are complicated, and there are things we admire greatly about them and things that we wish did not happen in their lives. But they were men, and they were men who did something quite extraordinary, and the women in their lives make that clearer than anybody.
Thank you, Kogi.